Okay, in this video, we're going to cover two different accounts receivable related ratios. We'll go through days sales outstanding, which is supposed to represent the number of days on average it takes a company to collect on their accounts receivable. And we'll go through expected credit quality, which is management's assessment of their customers' credit quality. So how likely are our customers to pay the accounts receivable that they owe us? And so let me share my screen. And what we're going to do is calculate these ratios for comparison companies and just compare and contrast across companies. So first, let's talk about days sales outstanding. To calculate days sales outstanding, you take the accounts receivable balance, and that's the gross accounts receivable balance, divide by total credit sales, and multiply by the number of days in the period. And the important thing to do is to make sure your number of days is on the same basis as the total credit sales. So if you use 1 year worth of total credit sales, you need to use 365 for the number of days. So that's the important point. So first, let's calculate this ratio for Chevron, which is a large oil and gas company. And then we'll calculate it for Whiting Petroleum, which is a small oil and gas company. So first, we'll take the accounts receivable balance. Let me show you what we need to calculate. We need to calculate a fraction and then multiply by 365. So in the numerator is accounts receivable. And I had to clean up this balance sheet a bit for Chevron because I wanted to make sure that the accounts receivable didn't contain anything that didn't relate to these sales. And so I had to strip out these notes receivable of the accounts receivable. So this is slightly adjusted, but just know that you get almost the same answer if you calculate it without making the adjustment. The adjustment was immaterial. So accounts receivable net was 9247 and the allowance was 849. So adding those two together, you get total accounts receivable gross. And I just wanted to show you the scale of Chevron. So I just added all of the zeros to the back end. So that's $9.2 billion of net accounts receivable and $849 million of the allowance. And you divide that by total credit sales, which I'm just going to use total sales down here of $139.8 billion. So that's the denominator. And when you multiply that fraction by 365, you get 26 days. So the interpretation is on average, it takes Chevron 26 days to collect cash from customers. Okay, now let's calculate the same for Whiting Petroleum. The numerator here, total gross accounts receivable, is 308,249. That's net accounts receivable plus $9 million for the allowance. And the denominator is $1.5 billion for their total sales. And when you multiply this fraction times 365 days, you get 74 days. So this is a significant difference between Whiting and Chevron. And there could be multiple explanations. So the first explanation could be that Chevron actually has some downstream operating activities. So I believe they sell gas at gas stations, for example. And in that line of business, they require their customers to pay immediately. So that fraction of their business would have 0 days outstanding, and that might be pushing their average down to 26. Another interpretation could be that Chevron has high bargaining power. So they're a large supplier of oil and gas. So when they are dealing with their customers who purchase oil and gas, their customers are in a weaker bargaining position, and they might be more willing to offer more generous payment terms to Chevron, paying Chevron more quickly. Whereas Whiting doesn't have much bargaining power with their customers because they're a small provider, they're a small supplier. So they might not get as good of payment terms from their customers. The other potential, so this is a third potential explanation, which would be that Whiting, being a smaller company, doesn't get as good of customers. So the credit quality of their customers is just worse. And we could actually calculate that. I haven't done that practice, but we could see if the estimated credit quality of Whiting Petroleum's customers is just worse than the Chevron. And if you have worse credit quality customers, it could be that they just take longer to pay. Okay, so that's days sales outstanding, and now let's move on to expected credit quality. And for expected credit quality, we'll compare Nordstrom and Target. So and we're going back to 2011 to calculate expected credit quality because this is when both of these companies still had their credit cards. So if you had the Nordstrom or the Target credit cards, those credit cards were actually banked, which means Target and Nordstrom dealt with the credit card receivables. They were banked by Nordstrom and Target. Target no longer banks its own credit card, and I'm not sure about Nordstrom. But so that's why we're going back to 2011 to do this analysis. So expected credit quality, and you can define this in many different ways. The way I like is taking a net accounts receivable and dividing by gross accounts receivable. And the reason I like it is it's an easy interpretation. The interpretation is of our total accounts receivable balance, how much do we expect to collect? That's the interpretation for the way I've defined expected credit quality here. So let's calculate this ratio. For Nordstrom, net accounts receivable, the amount they expect to collect is here, the asset balance, so 2026. And the total gross accounts receivable is 2026 plus 145. So Nordstrom expects to collect 93% of its total accounts receivable balance. For Target, the numerator is 6153, that's net accounts receivable, and the denominator is 6153 plus the 690. So Target expects to collect 90% of its gross accounts receivable. Now, interpreting the difference here, the difference is pretty small. If you had to interpret the difference, Nordstrom has a higher percentage. So that would mean that Nordstrom expects a greater percentage of their customers to pay off their receivables. In other words, Nordstrom has a higher credit quality customer on average, but it's only a slight improvement above Target's 90%. So that's that interpretation. Okay, so those are the two ratios I wanted to go through, and that's all I wanted to go through. So I hope you had fun going through those two ratios. I know I did, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.